How many of you remember the wonderful and crazy 60s? Remember the 60s? Good. How many of you think of yourselves, or maybe did think of yourselves as hippies in the 60s and the 70s? Any hippies? Come on, be courageous. 1, 2, 3, okay, good. Some hippies. Good. The 60s and the 70s were the decades of the hippies. And what did hippies stand for? Radical equality, right? Free love. Make love, no war. Woodstock, right? Those cute Volkswagen minibuses with flowers all over them. Hippies were a social movement that reminded us about the need for equality and about free love as well. But I will tell you something that might surprise you, because we as Christians, we as believers, should claim to be the original hippies. Long before 1960s, about 1,900 years earlier, the disciples of Jesus invented the hippie movement. Think about it for a second. In the Roman Empire, in the 1st century, Eucharist was the only time and the only place where the masters and slaves were able to sit at one table. Nowhere else was it legal for a slave to eat at the same time, at the same table with the master. Nowhere else, but only when they came to the Eucharist, hiding somewhere in the catacombs of private homes. The first generation of Christians believe in radical equality, in radical hospitality. The Eucharist of the 1st century was the only place in the Roman Empire where people from different races, different social class, could gather around one table. Nowhere else was this equality present. Nowhere else, no other community, no other group in the times of the Roman Empire was as open, as egalitarian, as inclusive as the first Christians. It was a social revolution of sorts. It was unheard of for slaves and masters to associate together. And yet, in the Eucharistic assembly, they were equal. When they came to pray as followers of Jesus, they gathered on the same level around the same table. They were the first hippies, long before the Woodstock, long before 1960s and free love and Volkswagen buses. Why was this equality so important to the first generation of Christians? Why they made Eucharist such an inclusive experience? Very easy. They all remembered what the Gospel of Mark told us this morning about how the first Eucharist came to be. Let's see if you listen carefully to one of these languages. How did Last Supper come to be? Jesus goes to Jerusalem, finds Motel 6 and gets a room, right? No. He tells two of his disciples, go into the city, you will meet a stranger, somebody you have never seen before. He will carry a jar of water, follow him. Whichever house he enters, you continue following him and go to that house. Ask to see the master of the house and tell him, our teacher, our rabbi, will eat dinner tonight at your place. There was no question there. Our rabbi will have dinner tonight with you. Quite arrogant, isn't it? Or Jesus knew that the person who is the host will welcome him with open arms. Think about it for a moment. If it wasn't for the hospitality of the house owner, there would be no Last Supper. If the stranger didn't open the doors of his household, Jesus and his disciples would be homeless for the Passover feast. If it wasn't for the hospitality, there would be no Eucharist as we know it. Would you open your door, your home, if somebody from the street knocked on your door and said, "Hi, how are you doing? I'll be having dinner with you tonight." Yeah, you will. Call 911. But this is exactly what happened. Somebody from the street comes to this poor, rich man's house and tells him, "I will have dinner with you tonight. Get me a guest room." If it wasn't for the radical hospitality of that man, there would be no Last Supper. Imagine that. If he didn't open his doors, there would be no Last Supper. That's why radical hospitality has been so important to the first generation of Christians. They knew that Eucharist is impossible without hospitality. That it is impossible to celebrate the body and the blood of Christ without in the same time opening wide the doors of your homes and the doors of your hearts. This was the very fundamental belief of the first generation of Christians. They remembered that they would be homeless, that there would be no Last Supper without hospitality. And so they extend the very same hospitality to everyone else. St. John Chrysostom, who lived in the 4th century, said a famous sentence about the Eucharist. And today, as we celebrate Corpus Christi, I believe it is a good thing to remember that statement. St. John Chrysostom said, "You will never be able to see the face of Christ in the bread and wine on the table if you are not able to see the face of Christ in the beggar on the steps of your church." It is impossible to believe in the body and blood of Christ on the altar if you don't believe that that poor person begging for change on the steps of your church is also the body and blood of Christ. And that's not my statement. This is from St. John Chrysostom in the 4th century. Our Holy Communion will do nothing for us unless we are able to see the face of Christ in the stranger, in the poor, in the homeless. Our Corpus Christi procession would mean nothing if we were not a hospitable community. I remember in 1986, John Paul II, who today is Saint John Paul II, whose image I have on my chasuble, organized a meeting of all world religions in Assisi in Italy. During this meeting, the Pope called for leaders of every faith to gather together and pray together for peace. At the central event of that meeting in 1986 in Assisi, the Pope was leading the prayers for peace with all kinds of religious people, with all kinds of shamans, gurus, imams, rabbis, Protestant pastors, and so on. The original design, the logistics were designed that way that the Pope would have a step above everyone else at the altar. So the Pope would be standing like 12 inches higher than anybody else. But the Pope refused to use the podium, and he stood on the same floor level with all the gurus, Native Americans, Indians, Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim, Jewish rabbis, and Protestant leaders on the same level around the altar. St. John Paul II understood that when we come to this table, we are on the same level. That there are no worse, no better people. That when we gather to pray together, when we gather to receive the body and blood of Christ, we become the body and blood of Christ, and thus we are radically inclusive and radically egalitarian. The church of the first century was the church of the hippies. The church of the 21st century has to become the church of radical hospitality, of radical equality. Only then the body and the blood of Christ will transform us into the Christ himself. As we go forth from this Corpus Christi Sunday, let us remember what St. John Chrysostom said. You cannot see the face of Jesus in the bread and wine on the table unless you see the face of Jesus in a beggar outside your church's door. Amen.